Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little stroll through the hallowed, often gilded, but ultimately quite dusty halls of European royalty. Imagine, if you will, a vast, echoing palace, perhaps Versailles, or maybe the Royal Palace of Madrid. Shrouded in the quiet of a deep night, the tapestries on the walls seem to whisper old secrets. The gold leaf gleams faintly in the moonlight filtering through tall windows. And the very air feels heavy with centuries of ambition, power, and, well, some truly questionable genetic decisions. You're wandering through empty ballrooms where once queens, draped in silk and jewels, glided across polished floors, their fates often sealed not by love or desire, but by cold, hard dynastic calculation. You hear the faint rustle of a long-gone gown, the phantom echo of a distant, royal sigh. Tonight, we're peeling back the velvet curtain to peek at something truly unsettling. What happened when those royal bloodlines got a little too close for comfort? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. You probably won't survive this without a nap, or at least a powerful urge to go to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where you're all nodding off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting our sleep-inducing exploration with a fundamental truth about European royalty. One that often gets glossed over in the fairy tales. Royal marriage was rarely, if ever, about love. Forget the swooning, the grand romantic gestures, the happily ever after narrative you grew up with. In the grand scheme of royal affairs, personal affection was a delightful, but largely irrelevant, bonus. Instead, you're looking at a chessboard, centuries in the making, where the pieces weren't bishops and knights, but eligible princes. And more to our point tonight, Europe's royal daughters. Each betrothal, each wedding, was a meticulously crafted political maneuver, designed to expand territories, forge alliances, secure peace, or, just as often, prepare for war, and, crucially, consolidate power. Imagine being a young princess, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, suddenly told you're to marry some distant cousin from a kingdom you've only vaguely heard of, all to secure a strategic port or a slice of disputed land. Your feelings, irrelevant. Your future happiness, a pleasant afterthought, at best. This system, while seemingly logical for maintaining power and preventing constant warfare, though it didn't always work. As historians still argue whether intermarriage actually reduced conflict or just shifted its battlegrounds, had a fascinating and ultimately devastating side effect. When the pool of eligible spouses is limited to other royals, and when those royals are all descended from a relatively small number of founding families, you quickly run into a rather sticky problem. You start marrying your relatives. And not just your third cousin once removed, whom you might see at Thanksgiving and politely ignore. We're talking first cousins, nieces marrying uncles, even more convoluted connections that would make your family tree look like a tangled ball of yarn. This wasn't some strange quirk. It was considered perfectly normal, even desirable, because it kept the royal blood pure. The idea was that by marrying within the same exalted lineage, you preserved the divine right to rule, the noble characteristics, and the very essence of royalty. It was believed to concentrate power and legitimacy, like trying to bottle lightning. Unfortunately, what it often concentrated instead were recessive genes. You see, for centuries, the intricacies of genetics were completely unknown. People understood traits could be passed down. They saw a child with their father's nose or their mother's eyes, but the concept of dominant and recessive genes, of mutations, of the very mechanics of inheritance, was light years away from the grasp. So, when a prince was born sickly, or a princess struggled with profound intellectual difficulties, it was attributed to divine will, a punishment for sins, or perhaps a bad humor. The thought that their meticulously pure bloodline might be the very source of their woes simply didn't compute. They were literally doubling down on the genetic hand, hoping for a royal flush, but often ending up with a very sad pair of twos. And it was often the daughters, those precious political pawns, who bore the brunt of these genetic gambles, their lives defined by the potential, or lack thereof, to produce heirs. And their bodies, sometimes, reflecting the cumulative burden of generations of closeness. As you continue your hushed journey through these royal archives, the name that inevitably rises to the top, shimmering with a kind of unfortunate notoriety, is the Habsburgs. Now, if European royalty were a reality TV show, the Habsburgs would be the undisputed, long-running, train wreck you can't look away from stars. They weren't just a royal family. They were the royal family when it came to consolidating power through marriage. And, inadvertently, demonstrating the perils of genetic isolation. Their reach was staggering, at various points controlling vast swathes of Central Europe, Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and even territories in the Americas. They literally painted the map of Europe with their family crests, often through strategic marital unions rather than outright conquest. It was an incredibly effective strategy for building an empire that spanned continents without constant, draining warfare, at least in theory. But here's the rub, and it's a big one, perhaps the biggest genetic oopsie in European history. To keep their immense power and wealth within the family, and to ensure their lineage remained pure and undisputed, the Habsburgs engaged in an astonishing, almost obsessive, degree of inbreeding. We're talking generations upon generations of close kin marriages. First cousins marrying first cousins was practically the norm. Uncles marrying nieces wasn't unheard of. And the family tree started to look less like a branching oak and more like a very tightly woven, increasingly unraveling knot. Imagine a family reunion where everyone is just a slightly different permutation of the same genetic material. Like a royal cloning experiment gone subtly wrong. It's almost comical, if the consequences weren't so tragic. This wasn't just a casual fling with a distant relative. The Habsburgs had a very deliberate policy of consanguineous marriage, believing it reinforced their divine right and kept their bloodline uniquely royal. They were, in essence, trying to bottle and preserve what they perceived as their inherent greatness. For instance, the marriage of Philip II of Spain to his niece, Anna of Austria, was just one of many such unions that became the norm. This wasn't an anomaly. It was the foundation of their dynastic strategy. This zealous dedication to purity meant that by the time you reached the later Spanish Habsburgs, the level of inbreeding was, frankly, astonishing. Historians still argue whether their initial success blinded them to the looming genetic disaster, or if they simply had no other viable options given the political landscape. Now, think about the practicalities of this for a moment. If you're a Habsburg princess in, say, the 17th century, your dating pool is essentially your immediate family or a very, very close branch of it. It must have been quite awkward at Christmas dinner, wondering which of your male cousins or uncles you'd eventually be married off to. Oh, Uncle Ferdinand, pass the salt. And are we still on for that dynastic alliance next spring? A truly charming prospect, wouldn't you agree? It strips away any notion of personal agency or choice, particularly for the royal daughters who were often little more than bargaining chips. Their bodies were quite literally the vessels for the continuation of a bloodline that, ironically, was slowly but surely poisoning itself. The implications of this relentless intermarriage were profound and, eventually, visible for all to see. While the Habsburgs managed to maintain their vast empire for centuries, their biological cost was immense. Their story serves as a chilling, real-world case study in population genetics. Long before anyone even knew what genes were, it's almost as if the universe was conducting a very slow, very elaborate scientific experiment on the dangers of a closed gene pool, with the Habsburgs as the unwitting, velvet-clad test subjects. And as you'll soon hear, the results were anything but favorable, especially for those delicate royal daughters caught in this elaborate, inbred web. Now, as we drift further into the quiet history of royal genetic missteps, Let's turn our attention to one of the most striking, and perhaps most famous, physical manifestations of the Habsburgs' peculiar family habits, the Habsburg jaw. You might have heard whispers of it, seen portraits where the royal chin seems to jut out with an almost aggressive prominence. Or perhaps noticed a certain heaviness in the lower lip. This wasn't just a fashion statement, nor was it a particularly unfortunate artistic trend. This was a direct, undeniable, and increasingly pronounced consequence of centuries of inbreeding, a genetic signature etched onto the very faces of Europe's most powerful dynasty. Imagine looking at a family album, but instead of seeing a diverse array of features, you notice a recurring theme, almost a caricature, that gets more exaggerated with each passing generation. That's essentially what happened with the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, as the fancy medical folks call it. It's a condition where the lower jaw grows significantly larger than the upper jaw, causing the chin to protrude and often leading to an underbite. It could make eating difficult, speech somewhat slurred, and, let's be honest, it wasn't exactly a look that launched 1,000 ships, unless those ships were sailing away very quickly. Combine that with a thick lower lip, and sometimes a rather prominent nose, and you had a distinctive, if not always aesthetically pleasing, royal profile. It was, in a strange way, a living, breathing advertisement for the purity of blood, even as it screamed genetic bottleneck. This wasn't just a minor cosmetic issue. While some individuals might have had a mild expression of the trait, others, particularly towards the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, displayed it in a truly severe form. You can see it clearly in portraits of Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, whose jaw was so pronounced that he reportedly struggled to chew his food and speak clearly. It's almost as if his face was trying to escape itself, a silent testament to the genetic burden he carried. Historians still argue whether the physical deformities were merely cosmetic or contributed significantly to the overall frailty and ill health of the later Habsburgs. But it's hard to deny the visual impact. Think about the social implications for a moment. If you were a Habsburg princess, destined to marry into another royal house, your portrait would be sent ahead, a visual resume, and while artists might have tried to soften the edges, the Habsburg jaw was undeniable. It was a brand, a genetic watermark, and for the women, whose beauty was often considered a valuable asset in the marriage market, this distinctive feature could be a double-edged sword. It marked them as undeniably royal, but perhaps also as undeniably, well, unique. One can only imagine the whispered comments in the courts of Europe when a new Habsburg bride arrived. Her chin leading the way. "Oh, she has the look, doesn't she?" they'd murmur, perhaps with a polite cough. The prevalence of the Habsburg jaw serves as a stark, visible reminder of what happens when genetic diversity is sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. It's a mainstream historical fact that these features were common, but the quirky tidbit is how consistently and severely it manifested in some individuals. Almost as if their bodies were screaming a warning that their minds couldn't yet comprehend. It's a fascinating, if slightly unsettling, example of how biology can leave its indelible mark on history, literally shaping the faces of power. And as we move forward, you'll see that this was just the tip of the genetic iceberg for these unfortunate royal lines. As the narrative of royal inbreeding unfolds, you start to notice a darker, more distressing pattern emerging, far beyond merely distinctive facial features. We're now venturing into the grim realities of early red flags, stillbirths and sickness. While the Habsburg jaw might have been a visible calling card, the true cost of these tightly woven family trees was often paid in silence, in hushed whispers behind palace doors, and in the tragically short lives of countless royal infants. Imagine a queen, perhaps a Habsburg daughter herself, enduring multiple pregnancies, only for each one to end in heartbreak. The nursery, once meticulously prepared with tiny silken blankets and polished wooden cradles, stands empty, or worse, holds the chilling stillness of a child who never drew a breath, or who faded away within days or weeks of birth. Stillbirths and miscarriages became disturbingly common occurrences in these highly inbred lines. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a statistical inevitability, a cruel lottery where the odds were stacked against the very continuation of the family. While some historians still argue whether the perceived increase was due to better record-keeping or actual genetic decline, the sheer volume of such tragedies is undeniable, and if an infant did survive birth, the challenges often intensified. Childhood illnesses, which were already a perilous journey in an era without modern medicine, became even more fatal for these royal offspring. You're talking about children born with weakened immune systems, inherited conditions, and a general frailty that made them incredibly vulnerable. Infancy and early childhood were veritable minefields for any child of this era. But for the most inbred royal children, it was like traversing that minefield blindfolded, often with an anvil tied to their ankle. It's a mainstream historical fact that child mortality rates were high across all social classes. But the specific patterns in royal families, particularly those deeply committed to consanguineous marriages, show a markedly higher rate of certain tragic outcomes. Think of it, the immense pressure on a royal woman to produce heirs, especially sons, was immense. Her entire purpose, her worth, was often measured by her fertility and her ability to provide healthy children for the dynasty. Now, imagine her carrying this burden, knowing that each pregnancy was a terrifying gamble, that the child she carried might emerge with severe deformities, profound intellectual disabilities, or simply be too fragile to survive. It's a level of emotional and physical torment that's hard to truly grasp, particularly when the root cause, the very purity of their bloodline, was considered the greatest asset. One quirky tidbit about this era is how these tragic losses were often interpreted. Instead of recognizing a biological pattern, they were frequently seen as divine judgment, a curse, or even the result of black magic. Physicians, operating with a rudimentary understanding of the human body, would offer bizarre remedies or attribute the deaths to humors being out of balance. The idea that their carefully constructed family tree was actually rotting from the inside was unthinkable. You can almost hear the frantic whispers of courtiers, seeking solace in prayer or desperate, ineffective treatments, all while the true culprit lay hidden in plain sight, silently passed down through generations. These early genetic red flags weren't understood for what they were, but they laid the groundwork for the more profound and devastating consequences that would follow. As the genetic dice continued to roll through the generations of inbred royalty, the consequences began to manifest not just in physical ailments and early deaths, but also, disturbingly, in the realm of the mind. We are now exploring the somber reality of mental decline, a fading brilliance. Imagine a lineage that once boasted shrewd politicians, brilliant strategists, and cultured patrons of the arts, slowly, subtly, becoming dimmer, their cognitive faculties dulled by the relentless march of recessive genes. It's a truly tragic aspect of the inbreeding story, the erosion of intellectual capacity and mental stability. While definitive diagnoses from centuries past are, of course, impossible to make with modern precision, historical accounts, letters, and the observations of courtiers paint a clear, if often heartbreaking, picture. You read about princes and princesses who struggled with learning, who displayed marked eccentricities, or who simply lacked the sharp intellect expected of a ruler. It wasn't always a sudden, dramatic onset of madness. More often, it was a gradual, insidious weakening of cognitive function, a persistent fog that settled over minds that should have been clear and decisive. Historians still argue whether some of the reported instances of madness were true mental illness or simply extreme eccentricity. But the trend of declining intellectual vigor in certain royal lines is a mainstream historical fact. Consider Charles II of Spain again, the poster child for the Spanish Habsburgs' genetic woes. Beyond his pronounced jaw and general physical frailty, contemporary accounts suggest he suffered from significant cognitive impairments. He was delayed in learning to speak and walk, struggled with basic understanding, and often seemed bewildered by the demands of kingship. Imagine being born into the most powerful position in Europe, yet lacking the mental acuity to govern effectively. His mind, much like his body, was burdened by the weight of centuries of pure blood, making his reign a struggle both for him and for his kingdom. It's almost as if his mental gears were stripped, unable to properly engage with the machinery of state. This isn't just about severe intellectual disability. It encompasses a spectrum of issues: learning difficulties, poor judgment, emotional instability, and a general lack of the keenness and foresight necessary for effective rule. While every family has its quirks, and not every royal anomaly can be attributed to inbreeding, the concentration of these issues in certain highly consanguineous lines is striking. It's a quirky tidbit that royal courts, often hotbeds of gossip and intrigue, inadvertently became clinical observers of genetic decline, even if they had no scientific framework to understand what they were witnessing. They simply recorded the melancholy, the oddness, or the slowness of their rulers, unaware of the deep biological roots of these traits. The fading brilliance wasn't just a personal tragedy for the individuals affected. It had profound political implications. A monarch prone to poor judgment, easily swayed, or simply incapable of grasping complex state affairs, could lead a nation into ruin. The very stability of kingdoms, which these marriages were supposed to secure, was thus undermined by the biological fragility of their rulers. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that the quest for absolute power and purity of blood could inadvertently lead to a dynasty's cognitive undoing, leaving them vulnerable to rivals and internal strife. The price of the pure lineage was, for many, the very intellect that might have preserved it. Now, as we near the tragic culmination of this genetic narrative, let's hone in on the most stark and poignant example of what inbreeding did to Europe's royal daughters and, indeed, their entire lineage: Spain's dynasty, a royal demise. The Spanish Habsburgs, having pushed the boundaries of consanguineous marriage to their absolute limit, serve as the ultimate cautionary tale, a dynastic grand finale that was less a bang and more a whimper. A slow, agonizing fade into extinction. Imagine a once mighty oak tree, seemingly robust, its branches stretching across a vast empire, but deep within its roots, a hidden rot is silently at work, gradually weakening its core until, one day, it simply cannot stand any longer. This is the story of the Spanish Habsburgs. For nearly 2 centuries, they ruled an empire upon which the sun truly never set, controlling vast territories from the Americas to the Philippines. Yet, their relentless pursuit of a pure bloodline, almost exclusively marrying within their family, often first cousins or uncle-niece pairings, led him down a genetic cul-de-sac. The cumulative effect of generations of these close unions was devastating, manifesting in a litany of physical and mental infirmities that ultimately doomed their line. Historians still argue whether the political and economic decline of Spain in this period was more attributable to systemic issues or the genetic incapacities of its rulers. But the latter certainly didn't help. The final act of this tragic drama centered around Charles II. Often dubbed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, a cruel nickname that tragically masked the true biological horror of his existence. He was the end product of 16 generations of inbreeding, with a mind-bogglingly low inbreeding coefficient, a fancy genetic term for how related your parents are, that would make any modern geneticist gasp. His family tree was less a tree and more a circle, with numerous lines leading back to the same few ancestors. For example, his mother was also his father's niece, and several of his great-grandparents were also closely related. It's a mainstream historical fact that Charles II suffered from a litany of ailments. He was physically frail, prone to illness, struggled with severe digestive issues, and was afflicted by profound intellectual disability and learning difficulties. He couldn't speak clearly, had difficulty chewing, and suffered from convulsions. He was, quite literally, crumbling under the weight of his own ancestry. Think about the position of the royal daughters in this scenario. While Charles II was the last king, The women of the Spanish Habsburg line often faced equally dire, if less publicly scrutinized, fates. They, too, carried the same genetic burden, enduring stillbirths, sickly children, or themselves suffering from the same physical and mental frailties. Their roles as producers of heirs, as vessels for the continuation of a dynasty, became a cruel paradox when the very blood they were supposed to perpetuate was the source of so much suffering. A quirky tidbit is how the court doctors, completely baffled by Charles II's condition, resorted to exorcisms and elaborate religious ceremonies, truly believing him to be possessed, rather than considering the obvious genetic implications. The idea of a bewitched king was easier to swallow than the terrifying notion that their divinely ordained lineage was intrinsically flawed. When Charles II died childless in 1700, after years of struggling to even produce an heir, it wasn't just the death of a king, it was the definitive end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict fought over who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. The line simply ran out. A victim of its own misguided quest for purity, the demise of the Spanish Habsburgs stands as a powerful, chilling testament to the long-term, devastating consequences of extreme inbreeding. A royal demise brought about not by external foes, but by the very genetic code within. As you trace the intricate, often sorrowful, threads of royal history, it becomes abundantly clear that while kings and princes might hold the overt power, the female fate, political pawns, was often far more precarious, particularly within the context of inbred royal lines. For a royal daughter, her very existence was often defined by her potential, or lack thereof, to serve as a conduit for dynastic power, a living bridge between kingdoms. Her body was not entirely her own, it was a vessel for the future of a family, a nation, an empire. Imagine being a young princess, perhaps raised in opulent luxury, surrounded by servants and tutors, yet acutely aware that your future, your very purpose, was entirely predetermined by political expediency. From a very young age, your eligibility for marriage would be assessed, not on your personality or intellect, but on your lineage, your perceived beauty, often a fleeting and subjective asset, and, crucially, your ability to bear healthy children. This was a mainstream historical fact of royal life across Europe. Daughters were the ultimate diplomatic currency, traded like valuable commodities to secure peace treaties, expand influence, or cement alliances. Their personal desires, their happiness, were secondary, if considered at all. Now, layer the problem of inbreeding onto this already constrained existence. For a princess from a heavily inbred line, like the Habsburgs, her value in the marriage market became a terrifying gamble. Not only was she expected to produce heirs, but those heirs needed to be robust, intelligent, and free from the visible or hidden burdens of consanguinity. You can almost feel the immense pressure, the silent judgments, the constant fear of failure. If she suffered from the characteristic Habsburg jaw, or the frail constitution that plagued her family, her prospects might diminish, or she might be married off to a less prestigious, but equally inbred, branch of the family, further concentrating the genetic problems. Historians still argue whether the increased pressure on royal women to produce heirs led to even more desperation for fertile matches. Regardless of genetic risk, consider the tragic example of Mariana of Austria, the niece of Philip IV of Spain, who was married to him, her uncle, and became the mother of the ill-fated Charles II. She herself exhibited some of the Habsburg traits and suffered numerous miscarriages and the loss of several children in infancy before finally producing Charles, who was, as we've discussed, a living testament to the family's genetic decline. Her life was a relentless cycle of pregnancy, loss, and the immense pressure to secure the succession, all while her body and lineage were working against her. It's a quirky tidbit that despite the suffering, many of these royal women were lauded for their piety and resilience, enduring their fates with a stoicism that was more born of necessity than genuine acceptance. They were, in a very real sense, casualties of a dynastic system that prioritized blood purity above all else. Even the well-being of its own members. The ultimate irony for these royal daughters was that their physical and mental health, compromised by generations of inbreeding, directly impacted their ability to fulfill their primary duty, ensuring the continuation of the royal line. If they produced stillbirths, sickly children, or no children at all, their value plummeted, their lives potentially becoming isolated and desolate. Regardless of their immense wealth or status, they were caught in a biological trap, designed by their own ancestors, with no escape. Their role as political pawns, therefore, was not merely about arranged marriages, but about being genetic vessels, often doomed to carry the very flaws that would ultimately bring down their family's grandeur. While the Habsburgs undoubtedly serve as the poster children for the perils of royal inbreeding, it's important to understand that their story, while extreme, was not entirely unique. As you softly turn the pages of European history, you'll discover that the practice of close kin marriage, driven by similar desires for power consolidation and blood purity, was common across various royal houses. So, let's widen our gaze slightly to beyond Habsburgs, other royal lines that also wrestled with the consequences of marrying too close to the family tree. Imagine, if you will, the interconnected web of European royalty as a vast, elaborate game of connect the dots. But almost all the dots are within the same small, exclusive club. Dynastic marriages were the norm everywhere. And while not every royal family pursued consanguinity with the zealous intensity of the Habsburgs, many did so out of necessity, tradition, or simply a limited pool of suitable spouses. You see, the higher up the social ladder you went, the fewer truly eligible partners there were who weren't already related to you. If you were a king or queen, marrying a commoner was almost unthinkable, unless you were trying to send a very specific, usually controversial, message. So, the choice was often between a distant, politically inconvenient noble, or a slightly less distant, genetically riskier relative. Take, for instance, the Portuguese royal family, the House of Braganza. They, too, engaged in a significant amount of inbreeding, often marrying into the Spanish Habsburg line itself, creating an even more intertwined genetic nightmare. You can see echoes of similar issues: physical frailties, mental health struggles, and difficulties with succession, appearing in their history. It wasn't always as dramatic as the Spanish Habsburg collapse, but the genetic costs were certainly there, manifesting in various forms of weakness and instability. This is a mainstream historical fact. Royal families across Europe were interconnected through a dense network of marital alliances, often involving various degrees of consanguinity. Even the British royal family, the House of Windsor, formerly Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, has a history of consanguineous marriages, though generally less extreme than the Habsburgs. Queen Victoria, for example, known as the grandmother of Europe, had 9 children who married into various European royal houses, spreading her genetic material, including, famously, the gene for hemophilia, across the continent. While not strictly inbreeding in every instance, the close familial ties meant that recessive genes, like the one for hemophilia, found pathways to express themselves in subsequent generations of European royalty, affecting males primarily, but carried by the royal daughters. It's a quirky tidbit that for centuries, these royal women, carriers of hidden genetic secrets, were unwitting participants in a vast, uncontrolled human experiment. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of certain genetic conditions in multiple royal families was solely due to consanguinity or exacerbated by other factors like poor sanitation, nutrition, and limited medical knowledge. However, the recurring pattern of specific inherited traits strongly points to the dangers of a closed gene pool. You can almost sense the slow, creeping genetic deterioration that must have felt like an inexplicable curse to these royal families. They were trying to preserve their lineage, their purity, their power, but in doing so, they inadvertently created a biological ticking time bomb, one that often impacted the royal daughters most acutely. as they were the ones expected to continue the lineage, regardless of the genetic hand they were dealt. As you settle deeper into this quiet recounting of royal woes, it's crucial to remember the historical context that enveloped these beleaguered monarchs and their suffering progeny. We're now delving into the realm of medical misunderstandings, ancient cures. Imagine living in an era where the very concept of a gene was light years beyond human comprehension, where illness was often attributed to imbalances of mysterious humors or even divine displeasure. This profound lack of scientific understanding meant that the true root of royal ailments, the genetic consequences of inbreeding, remained entirely hidden, leading to bizarre and often ineffective attempts at treatment. You see, for centuries, the prevailing medical theory in Europe was based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance among these humors, and illness was a result of imbalance. So, if a prince was weak and sickly, or a princess suffered from convulsions, a physician might prescribe bloodletting, to reduce excess blood, purging, to expel unwanted humors, or various herbal concoctions designed to rebalance the body. The idea that their very lineage, the source of their royal legitimacy, could be the cause of their physical and mental decline was simply unthinkable. A concept that defied their worldview. It's a mainstream historical fact that humoral theory dominated Western medicine for well over a millennium. Think about the sheer helplessness of it all. You are a powerful king or queen, surrounded by the finest doctors your kingdom can provide, yet they are utterly stumped by the recurring pattern of stillbirths, deformities, and intellectual disabilities within your family. They might observe the Habsburg jaw or the overall frailty, but their explanations would range from bad air to astrological alignments, from cold humors to the evil eye. A quirky tidbit is that royal doctors often had to produce elaborate, convoluted explanations for their failures, sometimes even blaming the patients themselves for their perceived moral failings, rather than admitting the limits of their knowledge or, God forbid, suggesting there was something inherently wrong with the sacred royal blood. Consider the desperate measures sometimes taken for the tragically afflicted Charles II of Spain. Beyond the ineffective medical treatments, priests performed exorcisms, genuinely believing him to be possessed by demons. Imagine being a young royal woman, perhaps a mother whose children are repeatedly born sickly or die young, and being told it's a punishment from God, or that you require a bizarre, painful cure for an imbalance no one truly understands. The emotional toll of this medical ignorance, combined with the personal heartbreak, must have been immense. Historians still argue whether the medical advice of the era actively harmed patients more than it helped. But it's clear it did little to address the systemic genetic issues. This profound medical misunderstanding meant that the cycle of inbreeding continued unchecked, even encouraged. Without a concept of genetics, there was no reason not to marry a cousin if it secured a powerful alliance. The royal daughters, those vital genetic conduits, were subjected to these ineffective treatments and endured repeated pregnancies, all while the underlying genetic issues compounded with each generation. The irony is that the very efforts to cure the symptoms were as misguided as the dynastic strategies that caused them, leading to centuries of suffering that could have, perhaps, been mitigated with even a rudimentary understanding of biological inheritance. But alas, science had not yet caught up to the consequences of royal ambition. As you continue to ponder the complex tapestry of royal life, interwoven with threads of power, privilege, and perplexing ill health, it's vital to understand another powerful, almost impenetrable, barrier to recognizing the truth about inbreeding: theological justifications, divine right. Imagine a world where the king or queen wasn't just a ruler, but God's anointed representative on earth, their authority flowing directly from the heavens. This deeply ingrained belief system provided an unshakable rationale for their very existence, and, crucially, for their unique marital practices, effectively shielding them from any uncomfortable questions about their lineage. You see, The concept of the divine right of kings wasn't just a convenient political slogan, it was a profound theological doctrine that shaped the entire fabric of European society for centuries. It posited that monarchs derived their authority from God, not from their subjects, parliaments, or any earthly power. This meant that their bloodline, their very heritage, was considered sacred, specially chosen, and imbued with a unique divine grace. To question the purity or health of that bloodline was, in essence, to question God's own wisdom. This was a mainstream historical fact that underpinned absolute monarchies across Europe. So, when royal families engaged in consanguineous marriages, even those that would raise eyebrows in any other social stratum, it wasn't seen as an act of biological folly. Instead, it was framed as a way to preserve this sacred, divinely ordained purity. Why would God choose a family, give them the right to rule, and then allow their sacred blood to be diluted by lesser mortals? It was almost a religious imperative to keep the bloodline pure and concentrated, even if it meant marrying a first cousin. Imagine trying to explain Mendelian genetics to someone who genuinely believes their monarch's every breath is a direct gift from the Almighty. Good luck with that. Think about the psychological impact on the royals themselves. They were raised from birth with the absolute conviction of their divine election. If a child was born with deformities or suffered from intellectual incapacities, it was more likely to be interpreted as a test of faith, a mysterious act of God, or even a demonic affliction, rather than a consequence of their family's marital choices. To suggest otherwise would be to undermine the very foundation of their power and identity. It's a quirky tidbit that court chaplains and theologians often played a crucial role in providing these spiritual explanations, inadvertently reinforcing the practices that caused so much suffering. They were, in a sense, the spin doctors of divine legitimacy. For the royal daughters, this theological framework added another layer of pressure and silence to their already constrained lives. If they failed to produce healthy heirs, or if their children were afflicted, it could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, or even a personal failing, rather than a genetic misfortune. This religious justification provided a powerful shield against any scientific inquiry or critical examination of the royal gene pool. Historians still argue whether the divine right theory was a genuine belief or primarily a tool for political control. But its practical effect was to make discussions about royal health, particularly in the context of inbreeding, almost taboo. The divine right to rule became, paradoxically, a divine right to suffer, all in the name of a sacred purity that was slowly, silently, destroying the very lineages it sought to protect. As the grand, slow-motion drama of royal inbreeding played out across Europe, the world outside the palace walls was subtly, but profoundly, beginning to change. We now turn our gaze to a new era, the Enlightenment's shadow. A period where reason, science, and individual thought began to chip away at the very foundations of divine right and ancient traditions, eventually casting a long, analytical shadow over the hallowed practices of royalty. Imagine the flickering gaslights of London or Paris in the late 17th and 18th centuries, illuminating bustling coffee houses where intellectuals, philosophers, and nascent scientists debated radical new ideas. This was the Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement that championed reason and empirical observation over superstition and dogma. While no one was yet talking about recessive genes or DNA, the very spirit of the age was one of questioning, of seeking rational explanations for the world's phenomena. This was a mainstream historical fact. The Enlightenment challenged established authority, including that of monarchs. This burgeoning emphasis on scientific inquiry, though initially far removed from the private lives of royalty, slowly began to exert a subtle pressure, as doctors and naturalists started to move beyond humoral theory, developing more systematic approaches to understanding the human body and disease. The old explanations for royal ailments, divine punishment or bewitchment, began to sound increasingly hollow to a more educated public, while the idea of royal blood being inherently flawed was still almost unthinkable. The very culture of inquiry was shifting. You can almost feel the chill wind of intellectual skepticism blowing through the dusty corridors of power. However, the change wasn't immediate or dramatic. Royal courts, often bastions of conservatism, were slow to adopt new ideas, especially those that might undermine their sacred status. It's a quirky tidbit that some enlightened thinkers, while embracing new scientific principles, still found ways to reconcile them with the existing social order, sometimes even arguing that a rational God would naturally choose a virtuous and capable ruler. This intellectual tightrope act meant that direct challenges to royal consanguinity were rare and often subtle. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of scientific principles by royal courts was due to genuine intellectual resistance or a strategic attempt to preserve traditional power structures. For the royal daughters caught in this transition, the Enlightenment offered little immediate solace. Their lives were still largely dictated by dynastic imperatives. While the philosophical underpinnings of their world were shifting, the practicalities of their genetic inheritance remained unchanged. They continued to be married off for political gain, continued to face the same risks of stillbirths, deformities, and intellectual frailty in their offspring. The scientific awakening was a slow-moving tide, and the consequences of centuries of inbreeding were a deep-seated problem that even the brightest minds of the Enlightenment couldn't solve without the tools of modern genetics. Yet, the seeds of change were being sown. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual liberty and the rights of citizens would eventually lead to revolutions that toppled monarchies and fundamentally altered the landscape of European power. This seismic shift would, in turn, affect royal marriage strategies, as the pool of suitable spouses might, paradoxically, expand when the divine right became less absolute. The shadow of the Enlightenment, therefore, while not immediately curing the genetic woes of royalty, set the stage for a future where such practices would be viewed with increasing scrutiny, no longer simply accepted as God's will. Now, as we consider the varying fates of Europe's royal houses under the cloud of inbreeding, a fascinating contrast emerges, like a slightly different bloom in a genetically uniform garden. Let's pivot our focus to the French exception, a different path. While the Habsburgs became the unwitting poster children for genetic peril, their great rivals, the French Bourbon dynasty, largely managed to avoid the most severe consequences of relentless consanguinity, even while remaining firmly entrenched in the tradition of dynastic marriage. Imagine the glittering court of Versailles, a universe unto itself, brimming with political intrigue, elaborate rituals, and an almost obsessive focus on grandeur. The French Bourbons were arguably the most powerful and influential monarchs in Europe for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet their approach to royal marriage, while still strategic, was subtly different from their Spanish Habsburg cousins. While they certainly married within the broader royal and high noble circles of Europe, they tended to avoid the extreme close-kin marriages, first cousin to first cousin, or uncle to niece, that became the hallmark of the Spanish Habsburgs. This is a mainstream historical fact. The French Bourbons, while part of the same interconnected royal network, generally maintained a slightly wider genetic pool. Why this difference? Historians still argue whether it was deliberate policy, a wider array of political opportunities, or simply a matter of chance. Perhaps the immense power and prestige of the French crown meant they had a larger pool of truly desirable, yet less closely related, aristocratic families to choose from. Or perhaps a more pragmatic approach to succession led them to prioritize genetic health, even if it wasn't understood in scientific terms, over absolute purity of blood. Whatever the reason, you don't see the same pronounced physical deformities or widespread cognitive decline that plagued the Spanish Habsburgs manifesting prominently within the main line of the French Bourbons. Think about the psychological relief this might have afforded their royal daughters, while they were still political pawns, married off for strategic alliances. The overwhelming fear of bearing severely deformed or intellectually impaired children, so prevalent in the Habsburg court, might have been slightly less acute. They still faced the pressure to produce heirs, but perhaps without the added burden of an almost guaranteed genetic lottery loss. It's a quirky tidbit that even within a system of arranged marriages, the degree of genetic risk could vary significantly between royal houses, leading to very different outcomes for the women involved. Of course, the French Bourbons weren't entirely immune to royal problems. They faced their own challenges, from political instability to financial woes, culminating in the tumultuous French Revolution. But their dynastic demise was not, primarily, a story of genetic collapse. It was a political and social upheaval that swept away centuries of absolute monarchy, rather than a slow, internal biological decay. This stands in stark contrast to the Spanish Habsburgs, whose end was undeniably intertwined with their genetic fragility. The French exception provides a vital comparative case study. It suggests that while the system of dynastic marriage was universal, the intensity of consanguinity within that system varied, and with it, the severity of the genetic consequences. The Bourbons demonstrate that it was possible to maintain power and prestige without necessarily succumbing to the most extreme forms of inbreeding, offering a slightly less bleak chapter in the otherwise often tragic narrative of royal bloodlines. Their story underscores that even within the constraints of royal tradition, some families found a path that, whether by design or accident, offered a degree of genetic resilience. As our quiet journey through royal history approaches its conclusion, we arrive at a seismic shift that would forever alter the landscape of European power and, by extension, the marriage strategies of its remaining royal families. This is the era of revolutionary changes, end of an era. Imagine the thunder of cannons, the roar of revolutionary crowds, and the unsettling rattle of tumbrils carrying monarchs to the guillotine. The Enlightenment had sown the seeds of change, but the French Revolution, followed by the Napoleonic Wars, was the cataclysm that irrevocably shattered the old order. You see, for centuries, the power of monarchs was seen as absolute, often divinely ordained. Their bloodlines were considered sacred, their right to rule unquestionable. But the storming of the Bastille in 1789, and the subsequent execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, sent shockwaves across the continent. It demonstrated, unequivocally, that kings and queens were not untouchable, that their authority could be challenged, overthrown, and brutally ended by the will of the people. This was a mainstream historical fact that reshaped Europe. This era of revolution and upheaval had profound implications for royal marriage strategies. When the very survival of monarchies was at stake, the old rules began to bend, and sometimes break entirely. The rigid adherence to marrying only within a small, exclusive circle of often related royals became less feasible, and perhaps less desirable. The pool of eligible spouses, paradoxically, might have broadened out of sheer necessity. A royal house clinging to power might find itself having to make alliances with less traditionally pure families. Or even, unthinkable just a century before, with successful military leaders or burgeoning industrialists. If it meant survival, historians still argue whether the post-Napoleonic era truly diversified royal bloodlines or simply shifted the patterns of consanguinity. Think about the psychological impact on the remaining royal daughters. While the pressure to produce heirs remained, the context had dramatically shifted. Their lives were still bound by dynastic duty, but now, that duty included the very real threat of losing their thrones, their heads, or their entire way of life. The focus might have shifted from pure blood to political stability or popular appeal. Marrying a slightly more distant relation, or even someone outside the traditional royal circle, might suddenly be seen as a pragmatic choice for the survival of the monarchy, rather than a scandalous aberration. It's a quirky tidbit that for some royal families, the threat of revolution effectively forced a genetic reset, albeit an involuntary one. The end of this era wasn't a sudden, clean break. Monarchies persisted, but they did so in a vastly altered political landscape. The 19th century saw a complex dance of restoration and revolution, but the absolute power of the divine right monarch was largely a thing of the past. This shift, combined with growing scientific understanding, though still without full genetic comprehension, subtly began to chip away at the unquestioned acceptance of extreme inbreeding. The consequences of such practices, once dismissed as divine will, would slowly start to be viewed through a more rational, if still incomplete, lens. The royal daughters, once merely genetic vessels for pure blood, found their roles morphing in a world where the very definition of royalty was being rewritten by popular sovereignty and geopolitical upheaval. The centuries-long, insulated genetic experiment of royal Europe was effectively, if painfully, coming to an end. Having witnessed the dramatic political upheavals that reshaped Europe, you might wonder about the genetic echoes, the lingering whispers of those centuries of intermarriage. In the royal families that endure to this day, we're now exploring the concept of genetic legacy, modern royal families. While the days of rampant, extreme inbreeding are largely over, the historical patterns of consanguinity have left subtle, sometimes surprising, imprints on the gene pools of contemporary monarchies. Imagine looking at a very old, deeply rooted family tree, even one that has seen new branches grafted on over time, while the most tangled knots from centuries ago might have been pruned or withered. The core structure, the shared ancestry, still remains. That's a good way to think about modern royal families. They are, almost without exception, still related to each other, forming a vast, intricate network that stretches back through European history. Queen Elizabeth II, for example, could trace her ancestry back to many of the same figures as the Spanish Habsburgs, though through far more numerous and less direct lines. This is a mainstream historical fact. Most European monarchs today are distantly related. The key difference, of course, is the increased genetic diversity over the last few centuries, as monarchies became more constitutional and less absolute, and as the old aristocratic hierarchies softened. The pool of acceptable spouses widened significantly. Royals today often marry commoners or individuals from less historically intertwined noble families, introducing fresh genetic material into lines that were once incredibly restricted. This dilutes the concentration of recessive genes that caused so much suffering in earlier centuries. You're unlikely to see a Habsburg jaw in its severe historical form walking around Buckingham Palace today. For instance. However, the legacy isn't entirely erased. Think back to the quirky tidbit about Queen Victoria and haemophilia. While the most severe forms of the disease have been largely bred out or managed with modern medicine, the gene itself was passed down through various European royal houses. This illustrates how even relatively less intense consanguinity can distribute specific genetic traits or predispositions across a wide network of related families. Historians still argue about the subtle impacts of historical royal genetic patterns on personality traits or physical characteristics in modern royals. Acknowledging the difficulty of isolating genetic influence from environmental factors, you might find it fascinating to consider that while the devastating consequences of extreme inbreeding are now largely a historical curiosity, the mere fact of shared ancestry among royal families means they still carry a slightly higher prevalence of certain traits or genetic markers compared to a truly random population. It's not about severe deformities anymore, but perhaps about shared predispositions to certain conditions or very subtle, shared physical characteristics that might only be noticeable to a keen observer of old portraits. The royal daughters of today, thankfully, are no longer subjected to the same terrifying genetic gamble as their ancestors, able to make choices for love and partnership rather than solely for dynastic preservation, and with the full benefit of modern medical science. So, while the most terrifying chapters of royal inbreeding are firmly in the past, the lines of connection still stretch across centuries, reminding us that every family, even the most exalted, carries its history within its very DNA. The pure blood of yesteryear has become, through the crucible of revolution and the slow march of genetics, a much more diverse and resilient stream. As our long, quiet journey through the tangled, often tragic, history of Europe's royal daughters draws to a close, we arrive at the final, overarching truth, lessons learned, a royal warning. The story of inbreeding within royal lines isn't just a collection of unfortunate historical anecdotes, it's a profound, real-world demonstration of fundamental genetic principles, and a chilling reminder of the unforeseen consequences when human ambition clashes with biological reality. Imagine, one last time, that silent, echoing palace. But instead of sadness, there's a faint glimmer of understanding, a quiet wisdom whispered from the past. What did inbreeding do to Europe's royal daughters? It turned them into unwilling participants in a vast, uncontrolled genetic experiment. It subjected them to lives often defined by physical frailty, mental impairment in their children, and the crushing burden of stillbirths and early deaths. Their bodies became crucibles for the concentration of deleterious recessive genes. Their lives a testament to the biological cost of pure bloodlines. This is the overarching, mainstream historical fact that emerges from studying these dynasties. The most poignant lesson, perhaps, is the sheer irony of it all. These royal families, driven by a desperate desire to consolidate power, secure their lineage, and maintain an almost mystical purity of blood, inadvertently introduce the very weaknesses that often led to their decline or even extinction. The quest for absolute control over their destiny led to biological chaos within their own bodies. It's a quirky tidbit that for centuries, the very source of their perceived legitimacy, the pure lineage, was simultaneously the greatest biological vulnerability. Think about the contrast between their immense wealth and power, and their profound helplessness in the face of these genetic realities. They could command armies, build palaces, and shape the course of nations. But they could not command their own genes. They had access to the best physicians of their day. Yet those physicians, operating in an age of profound medical misunderstanding, were utterly powerless to treat the root causes of their suffering. Historians still argue whether a more enlightened understanding of genetics would have changed royal marriage practices earlier, or if dynastic imperatives would have continued to override biological wisdom. This historical saga serves as a timeless warning. It underscores the vital importance of genetic diversity, the hidden strength found in variety, and the inherent dangers of a closed gene pool. It illustrates that nature, ultimately, has its own immutable laws, and attempts to circumvent them, no matter how powerful or divinely ordained, often come at a heavy cost. For the royal daughters, this cost was paid in pain, in loss, and in lives that, despite their gilded cages, were often far from fairy tales. And so, as we leave the silent echoes of these ancient courts behind, let the story of what inbreeding did to Europe's royal daughters serve as a gentle, quiet reminder. It's a reminder that even in the pursuit of power and prestige, there are fundamental truths that, if ignored, can lead to the most profound and unexpected forms of demise.